Hello everyone, welcome back to Average Aviator. I'm Travis, and we're going to go on a little ferry adventure where I ferry this 1946 Aeronca 7AC Champ with a 65 horsepower engine from Connellsville, Pennsylvania to Scranton, and then from Scranton to Chicago, Illinois area. This Champ became known to me as the Champ from Hell because I had so many issues trying to get it delivered, from maintenance issues to run-ins with the FAA to weather. I mean, just so many issues. So stick around and let's just get right into it. So I originally picked up this Champ in June of 2022, and when I first picked it up, it was the stereotypical ferry. It hadn't flown much at all in the last 10 years, maybe 25 hours in the last 5 years, but it seemed like it was taken care of relatively decently. The paint was in good shape, the paperwork was all there, but this particular Champ did not have an electrical system. Thankfully, the seller included a handheld radio along with a box of other goodies that included chocks, a fuel dipstick specifically calibrated for this fuel tank, and a bunch of other stuff that any owner or any ferry pilot would love to have. That comes into play a little bit later in the story. After thoroughly checking out the airplane, I took it for a quick test flight, and it actually flew really well. It didn't climb very good, but that's kind of expected for a 65 horsepower Champ. So after that initial test flight went pretty well, I landed, loaded up, refueled, and took back off again on a beautiful day and headed to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, which was the one intermediate fuel stop that I had planned on the way to deliver the airplane to Scranton. I chose Lock Haven as a fuel stop because it was about halfway, and that was the week of the Sentimental Journey fly-in, where everyone flies in to Piper Memorial Airport to celebrate the legacy of the Piper Aircraft Company. After landing, grabbing a bite to eat, and checking out some of the cool airplanes there, I refueled and checked the oil. To my surprise, the oil level showed just 1.5 quarts, meaning in the 1 hour and 45 minutes it took to fly to Lock Haven, the little 65 horsepower engine had burned over 2 quarts of oil. Thinking this to be a fluke, or perhaps not all the oil had drained back into the sump yet, I added a 1.5 quarts of oil just to get back up to 3 quarts, and I buttoned everything up. A fellow pilot was nice enough to give me a hand prop, and I taxied out, headed to deliver the Champ to Scranton. I took off from the grass on that hot summer day and found myself very low over the town, looking down thinking, man, this thing isn't climbing for shit. And the moment, I attributed it to the small engine, the 3,500 foot density altitude, and to be fair, I'd never flown a Champ, nor behind a 65 horsepower engine before, so I figured it must just be standard procedure to be on the edge of stall, full power, and still barely climbing with these kinds of airplanes. But the engine felt relatively normal, and all the engine indications were good, so I slowly made my way up to 3,500 feet, and over to Seaman's Field. With its long travel Oleo strut landing gear, the Champ really makes you feel like you're a great pilot, because every wheel landing is a greaser. I met the new owner of the Champ, who was nice, but he hinted at the fact that he only bought the airplane to try to sell it to someone else for a profit. Nonetheless, he gave me a ride to Scranton International, where a friend picked me up for a flight back in his extra 300L. That was one of the coolest, most uncomfortable flights I have ever experienced. You can't see jack out the front seat, but we got back to Connellsville to pick up my car in about an eighth the time it took me to fly that distance in the Champ. I thought this would be the last I saw of that Champ, but boy was the adventure just beginning. A week or so later, I got a call from the owner in Scranton saying he had sold the Champ, but the sale depended on me being able to deliver the airplane. I then got a call from the new buyer asking for a quote to deliver the airplane to Illinois Valley Regional, just south of Chicago. After I gave him the quote, the new buyer asked for some insight into the condition of the Champ, seeing that I had just ferried it not long before. I wasn't going to lie to a fellow pilot, so I told him straight up. The paint and interior were great, but the performance seemed a little bit dismal, and it was eating oil for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He appreciated the info, we ended the call, and I thought that was that. But soon after, I got another call from the owner in Scranton cussing me up a storm because I blew the sale. Again, I thought that would be the end of it. But about a week later, the guy in Illinois called and said that they had done a compression test and it had come back all 70s out of 80s, so he decided to go ahead and buy the Champ anyway. I finished up the ferry I was currently on and headed back up to Scranton. Ironically, the guy who cussed me up a storm ended up picking me up from the airport, so that was an odd car ride up to Seaman's Field. When I was pre-flighting the Champ, I noticed that the box of goodies that I had originally delivered with it was nowhere to be found. When I asked the seller where the chocks, tie-downs, radio, and fuel dipstick had gone, he replied with something like, it never came with those. Figuring pushing the issue would lead to nowhere, I decided to press on without those very useful items. I made my way back across Pennsylvania towards Pittsburgh and had to dodge some storms, but as I neared Indiana, Pennsylvania, the remnants of the storms made a very picturesque flight, topped off with a rainbow overhead as I landed and stored the Champ in a friend's hangar for the night. The next day, I went to continue the ferry, but when I did the run-up, the left mag had a horrible vibration and an RPM drop. I tried to run it up and burn it off, but to no avail. I taxied back and started pulling spark plugs to see if I could find the problematic fouled plug. I started with the bottom cylinders, and I soon found the smoking gun. On the number 3 cylinder, the plug I pulled out was the most fouled spark plug I have ever seen. I checked all the spark plugs, and most were not too bad, so I cleaned them up and reinstalled them. I did another run-up, and everything was normal, so I pushed power for takeoff. But after reaching about 50 feet, I felt the engine lose power and develop a horrible vibration. I quickly pulled a low close downwind and landed as soon as possible. A mag check on the ground revealed a miss on the left mag again, so once again, I pulled the spark plugs. The horribly fouled plug was again horribly fouled, albeit this time not as bad as it was the first time. I cleaned the plug and reinstalled it, and instead of trying to take off, I did a full power run-up instead. After several cycles of cleaning that number 3 bottom spark plug and a full power run-ups, I was able to work out that the clean plug would work until I applied high power settings where it would quickly foul in less than a minute. Absolutely perplexed, I called my mechanic and he suggested to try the BY long electrode plugs because they were more resistant to fouling. I swapped the problematic plug for a BY spark plug and sure enough it seemed to work. After thorough ground testing, I took back off and headed west once again, but I only made it about 15 miles before the roughness and telltale signs of a fouled plug came back. Thinking this was a very real possibility, my route took me directly over my home airport of 6P7 McVille, so it was an easy divert for me. Me and my mechanic ran through several other troubleshooting options and testing before determining that the only option left was to pull the cylinder and see what was going on. What we found after pulling the cylinder was absolutely astonishing. The cylinder wall had 2 really nasty gouges in it that perfectly matched the track of the piston pin. What was more telling was the fact that the piston pin was completely new and its aluminum end caps were in perfect shape. After a quick look in the logbook, I have developed a theory as to what exactly happened. My theory is that the old piston pins ate through the end caps, gouged the cylinder wall, and produced metal that was found during a routine oil change. Then, instead of changing the cylinder, the mechanic simply just replaced the piston pin and end caps with a new one and slapped the old cylinder back on. The cylinder was able to pass the compression test with flying colors because the compression test is done at top dead center, which is above the line of the piston pin gouge. But once the piston retracted, the gouge allowed all the oil and gases to pass right around the piston, which is why it was burning so much oil and fouling plugs so quickly. We ended up finding a spare cylinder to put on and tried to match the color, but unfortunately we ended up giving this poor C65 an oddly golden cylinder. In any case, we were able to put it all back together and perform post-maintenance engine runs and test flights. After we confirmed the engine seemed to be running well and the fouling/power loss problem had gone away, I again set off west towards Chicago. Now, as a reminder, this Champ did not have any electrical systems, so it had no radios installed and required hand propping to start the engine. Although I was able to scrounge some chocks and ropes to assist with the hand propping after the previous owner took everything useful out of the Champ before I got there, I was unable to source another handheld radio. I have since bought my own handheld radio and take it with me on almost every ferry now, but at the time, I didn't have one. Nonetheless, I took off for Chicago as if I was flying the Champ when it was new in 1947, VFR without a radio. I chose Marysville, Ohio as my stop for the night as the 4-flight reviews were good and it was the perfect distance to get maximum safe range of the Champ. I checked the NOTAMs and TFRs like any good pilot would do, and there was nothing except one NOTAM saying that the paved runway was closed. I figured this must have been due to maintenance on the runway or something, as the shorter grass runway was open. I made my way over to Marysville, and as I got close, I circled around above the pattern to sequence myself into traffic, as I figured people would not be expecting an airplane to be operating without a radio. I saw some helicopters and a biplane taking off and landing in the grass, as well as a larger gathering of people on the ramp of the airport. But my focus was on looking for traffic and landing, which I did on the grass runway uneventfully. I didn't notice there was no real place to park until after I taxied off the runway. I pulled into a spot on the opposite side of the FBO and shut down. When I climbed out, a person who looked like an event coordinator came up and said something to the effect of, "Hey buddy, the airport is closed and the FAA's here and they are probably going to want to talk to you." Well, that sure was a shock. I quickly pulled the NOTAMs back up, took a screenshot, because they still hadn't changed. The only NOTAM or TFR was still that NOTAM for the closed runway. But the event coordinator explained that they had been trying to call me on the radio to tell me not to land. I explained that A, I was not required to have a radio to fly in the airspace or land at the airport, and B, telling people over the radio that they can't land is not a legitimate way to close an airport. But, whatever. Thankfully, instead of being met by the FAA, the airport manager came over and essentially took me underneath his wing. I figured he would be mad at me for landing at his closed airport, but he actually was delighted at the fact that I had landed as I did. We got the Champ tucked into the hangar next to the biplane that happened to be flown by my friend and fellow ferry pilot, Andrew King. All three of us went to dinner that night, and the airport manager explained that they have this balloon festival every year, and normally they have people fly in, but this year a new FAA guy had decided that it was going to be considered an air show, and so it had to be closed to outside traffic. The airfield manager explained that the conversation between him and the FAA reps went something like this. Airfield manager: well, is there going to be a TFR? FAA rep: no, it doesn't warrant a TFR. Airfield manager: well, what will stop people from landing then? FAA rep: just note them the runway closed, but not the grass runway because the biplane can't give rides off a closed runway. Airfield manager: what stops people from landing on the grass runway? FAA rep: just tell them over the radio they can't land. Airfield manager: I don't think that's gonna work, but the balloon fest is tomorrow, so I guess that's what we're gonna have to do. The airport manager also said that he was pretty elated that I had proved his point by landing completely legally. The FAA must have also realized his point because I never got a visit or a phone call about it. The next morning, I planned my route west and found an airport that was the perfect range for the Champ. KMZZ Marion Municipal. I checked the NOTAMs at the FBO, and when I saw that one of the runways was NOTAM closed, I joked with the guy working the desk saying, I wonder if that's supposed to mean the airport's closed. So I typically plan for a healthy fuel reserve when I ferry airplanes. I'd rather stop 500 times more than necessary than run out of fuel once. As I arrived overhead Marion, I noticed that there was a crowd on the ramp and what seemed like drag racing going on the crow's runway. Not wanting to risk landing at another improperly closed airport or getting run into by an unsuspecting drag racer at the intersection, I elected to carry on to the next airport. The nearest airport with fuel was Kokomo, Indiana, and only about 18 nautical miles away. But with the headwind, I figured that it would take about 20 minutes in the Champ. Even adding that 20 minutes, it was still within my conservative fuel calculations of landing with 30 minutes reserve. But before I made it halfway to Kokomo, the Model T style fuel gauge was bouncing precariously between 0 and a quarter tank. Not wanting to end up in a cornfield, I elected to divert to Converse County as it was only 5 miles away at this point. I knew it didn't have fuel, but I figured I'd rather walk to get fuel from a gas station than explain why I ran out of fuel. Converse County turned out to be a very odd airport. It was like a round concrete slab just surrounded by cornfields. It had a singular runway painted east-west in the diameter of that concrete slab. I landed and taxied over to what looked like some hangars and bleachers, then shut down. I got out and tried to look in the fuel tank to get an accurate idea of how much fuel there really was, but one of the things that the previous owner had taken for himself was the fuel dipstick. After contemplating my options, I picked a long piece of grass that was growing up through the concrete and carefully lowered into the fuel tank. Using the discoloration on the grass and what I remembered of the markings on the dipstick, I figured I had just about 4 gallons left, which made sense with my flight time, and the fuel gauge was only bouncing off empty because of the turbulence. 4 gallons was plenty to make it the 7 miles to Kokomo, but trying to limit risk where I could, I fired up the Champ and took off straight ahead across the concrete circle, not wanting to waste fuel taxiing to the marked runway, as it really didn't matter. I made it to Kokomo with exactly half an hour's worth of fuel to spare. Not something I like to do if I can avoid it, but I refueled, checked the weather, and was off west again. The weather that day was stereotypically Midwest, with, scattered rain showers and ceilings. Most all the stations were calling VFR with, anywhere from 3,000 to 1,000 foot ceilings with scattered rain showers around, but nothing too crazy. But as any pilot who's done some real cross country before, it can be hard to tell exactly what the weather is doing in between reporting stations. As I made my way west, the ceilings seemed to creep lower and lower, and then the visibility started dropping, and I started looking for a place to land. I had just passed a private strip with a hangar home that looked pretty well taken care of, so though I wouldn't normally land at a private strip unannounced, I figured it'd be much better than getting swallowed up by the weather in the slow Champ. Thankfully, I had made the right call because the couple that owned the hangar home were awesome, and the weather turned even worse. After an hour or so, the weather seemed to pass, and one of the owners of the strip took me up in their airplane to scout around and see if it really had cleared up. The path ahead looked clear, so I thanked them profusely, and they invited me to their fall fly-in at the house in a couple months. Unfortunately, I was unable to make it to the fly-in, but that divert was well worth it. When in doubt, just land. Thankfully, the rest of the ferry to KVIS was uneventful, and I got the airplane delivered to the new owner. After the cylinder change, the oil consumption had slowed, but still was very high for a C-65, averaging about 1 quart every 2 to 3 hours. Thankful to be finally done ferrying that Champ, I returned home, once again thinking that would be the end of it. But alas, I had one more interesting run-in with this Champ. About a year and a half later, I returned to KVYS to pick up an Ercoupe and deliver it to Florida. I cruised up around 3,500 feet, and the Ercoupe was running smooth, until all of a sudden, it was not. An odd, not violent, but not subtle vibration developed at the snap of your fingers. I tried everything to figure out what the source of the vibration was, but to no avail. So I diverted to the nearest airport, which was C-75, Marshall County. As I rolled to a stop in front of the open maintenance hangar, like a long-time arch nemesis, I immediately recognized the airplane in the back of the hangar. There it was, Aeronca Champ, November 84100. And you know what it was in maintenance for? It was getting a full engine change. In fact, the engine with the golden cylinder was laying right on the floor next to it. Apparently, the owner had sold it to some poor kid who was hoping to get a cheap time builder. And I wonder why the owner never told the kid to call me to get my opinion on it. But anyway, that's the story of the Champ from Hell. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and learned something. Subscribe to follow along for more ferry adventures. See ya.